record on this computer? Fabulous. All right, welcome to Mastering the Art of the Interview. We're interviewing 101. Today, we're going to talk about the types of interviews you might expect as part of your job or internship search, as well as the kinds of questions you might be getting and how you can answer those questions. Keep in mind that getting the interview is the first step, and getting there, you're already in a place that a lot of people would like to be. So let's go to present mode. All right, so we are going to start by talking about the types of interviews. Let me just click through this into the next deck. All right. So things have changed a little bit overnight. Not overnight, about a year ago. Y'all know the pandemic happened, and interviews have changed a little bit. So you'll see occasionally in this slide deck, I refer to some of the resources and handouts we have in the Career Center. You can see on the left-hand side is our interview basics handout. At the end, I will show you where to find all of these. Most of this content is taken from there, but essentially there's often a sequence of types of interviews for any internship or job. Typically there's a round one and a round two, in addition to sometimes a third or fourth or fifth round, depending on what the role is. Many positions have, I would say, between 2 and 3 rounds typically. Round one is usually after you've submitted your resume and cover letter. Round one is typically either a phone screening with an HR person or a hiring manager. Anybody want to explain the difference between an HR person and a hiring manager? What's the difference between those two folks? Anybody want to hazard a guess? I know they sound very similar. When I'm making a distinction here, it's essentially the HR person is a recruiter who's part of their job is finding great candidates. And when I refer to a hiring manager, I'm talking about the person that this position would report into. So depending on the size of the company and their structure and policies, you might do a phone screening with the person you would be reporting directly into, or you might do a phone screening with someone who works in the human resources department who's recruiting for multiple roles. You don't prepare for those wildly differently, but it's good to know which one you're speaking to, because the recruiter isn't going to know as much about the day-to-day of the job as the hiring manager, typically. During the pandemic, video screening became increasingly more popular. It was already trending. One-way video, when I make a reference here to one-way video, that's a situation where you're seated in front of your phone or your computer, you're using their app or platform, and it will prompt you with a specific question in text, or sometimes it'll be a quick video of a question, and it will then go to a space where you have time to record your answer or response to that prompt. In most cases, these tools give you multiple tries. You know, they're like, all right, you recorded this, you can have another attempt. So that's great to know, but you'll want to prep for those regardless. A two-way video screen would be basically the same as the phone screen, only you'd be using Zoom or a video platform. That means that there's someone live talking to you on the other end. The one-way screen, they're not live. It's either a pre-recorded video of them asking a question or just the text of that question. Video screening is becoming more and more and more popular because it's something that you can actually, so for example, if they want you to do a one-way video screen, you don't have to schedule it, right? You can just do it when you have time, and then they have access to it. And they'll typically give you a deadline by which they want you to complete that one-way video screen, but it's a pretty convenient tool for a lot of employers. So that's typically round one, the screener. And in the screener, they need your pitch, right? They just need you to be able to articulate why you're a match. And that's your primary goal of the screener call, is to get them to consider you for the second interview. Now, the second interview can take a lot of different forms. And like I said, I'm calling this round 2 plus, because sometimes there are third stages. In many cases, there are third stages or fourth stages. So round 2 can take these formats. You might go from, in round 1, phone screening with someone who works in human resources, to round 2, a phone conversation or a Zoom conversation or a face-to-face conversation with someone who's the hiring manager, right? That might be their round 2. Another round 2 option, it's less common, is a group interview. Now, a group interview, typically, like sometimes a face-to-face interview is with a single person or a whole team, but there's also this thing called a group interview where you and other people applying for the same opportunity are in an interview all together, which is a totally different thing to prep. And it's not that they're necessarily specific industries that are doing these more often than not, but if you do get invited for a round 2 and you see there's a lot of people on the list, you do want to find out, just kind of figure out, are these all people who already work there? Or am I part of a larger group of people who will be in a group and be asked to either do a presentation or answer questions as part of that group? That's another kind of interview. The presentation interview is also increasingly common, and that might be around 3. Sometimes that's around 2 plus, it depends, but that's where you're asked to come and give a presentation to a particular group. These are very common in higher education for obvious reasons. It's important that we have presentation skills, but you'll see them in a lot of other industries as well. And when you get invited to an interview, they will usually provide enough information for you to figure out exactly what this interview is and who you're meeting with. A case interview is a kind of a very specific interview in consulting where you are presented with a case study and you are asked to answer questions about that interview. That's a whole separate prep process that we can talk about, but we're not going to get into today. That's a very different kind of interview. And a technical interview is also very different in terms of sometimes a technical interview will be primarily questions about your experience with software technology, or even like very specific pointed questions about how would you solve this particular problem if a network was doing A, B, or C. And these are very common in technology roles. And sometimes that's round 2, sometimes it's round 1. So when you get invited for an interview, it's important to know that you can ask, sorry, there's gnats with my plants. You can ask for information about the nature of the interview, who will be there, and what kinds of questions to expect. Any questions about types of interviews? Let me just make sure I can see the chat, and then please feel free to unmute if you have a question. All right, there will be time for questions at the end too. I'm going to get into types of questions. And again, most of this content is pulled from our resources. In DePaul, we talk about 3 different kinds of questions. Technically, there's 4, but the 2 most primary kinds of questions you'll get asked in the interview are about your qualifications and about your behaviors. So the qualifications are really focused on what makes you qualified for this role. How are you a match for this role? They want to know about your skills and experience. The behavioral questions ask you to provide a story around how you've practiced a particular soft skill. Typically soft skills, sometimes some hard skills. And the way you answer these is different enough. And these questions are very common that we'll go through a bunch of samples during this presentation. Scenario questions are the questions when they say, for example, if this happened and this were the situation, what would you do, right? So they would present a scenario to you, a particular story, and then they would ask you to identify how you would proceed. These questions are very much focused on whether or not you can think on your feet, you know, and there isn't necessarily a way to prepare for those questions, except to know that they exist and to understand that the way to successfully answer those questions is to demonstrate that you can think on your feet, but you're also not, you know, that you're also someone who would be aware that there are other people who may need to be involved in whatever the decision is. But we'll focus primarily on the qualifications questions and the behavioral questions. The 4th category are the gotcha questions. We're not going to spend a lot of time on those. Those are the ones like, if you were in a kitchen appliance, what would you be? If you had to describe yourself in 1 word, what would it be? Those are impossible to practice for as well. And they, you know, they go in and out of fashion, really. But those are the ones where you just want to be able to, again, think on your feet and be confident. And they just want to see you kind of handle something unpredictable in the moment. I apologize. There will be a child playing with an Oculus Quest in the background. I did not plan that for my presentation. I hope it's not too distracting. Maybe I'll switch my background really quickly so you guys don't have to manage that. We're going to get into some qualifications questions and some samples in just a minute. Let me just quickly put on a background so you don't have to deal with watching VR happening in the background. Let's see if that moves it. Okay. All right, there we go. So this is a screenshot. Oh goodness, let me go back. This is a screenshot from one of our handouts, really introducing what are the kinds of qualification questions you should be prepared for. You can see some here. Tell me about yourself. Now you might wonder, how is that a qualification question? Because they're not asking you to tell your life story, right? They're asking you to tell them who you are in a nutshell in a way that relates to this role. Other kinds of qualification questions are what interests you about this position. They're definitely not asking you to tell them like what your personal hobbies are here. They want to know how you're aligned with the role. What is a match between your interest and this role? The strength questions, the weakness questions, and then another one that's common is what do you think your biggest challenge will be? These are all questions. Anytime I have a student who's got an interview or if I have my own interview, these are questions that I script in advance. I 100% believe in scripting, unless you're someone with a photographic memory who's worried they're going to sound like a robot. I think scripting is the best way to be calm and collected and have good answers. Am I going to read the script? No. But the act of writing it and sometimes going over it before your interview will put all that stuff in the word bank of your brain so that you're ready to go. So some of the tips for qualifications are to use every opportunity to make a positive claim about yourself and to provide evidence, to be very positive and succinct. Now, succinctness is hard to plan for. Particularly, I like to talk. I can talk for 12 hours about pretty much any topic you want. So when I'm scripting interview answers, one of the benefits of planning that in advance is I can edit, tighten, so that my instinct to just is at least mitigated. And you do want to try and limit your answers to about 2 minutes at most in the preparation stage. If you're in the interview, there's a flow, you're going to go with that. So we'll go into some of those questions in a minute, but let's get into the other categories. I talked before about behavioral questions. These are questions that ask you to really describe a specific story or example of how you practiced a particular skill. Like I said, these are often soft skills, but they can also be hard skills. For each of these questions, and like I said, we'll go through these, they want to hear how good you are at communicating, how self-aware you are about, things that you've experienced and your role in those things. And they want to see if you can be positive about something challenging. So for each one, you really do want to think through a positive response. Even if it's a conflict question, you're going to talk about what you learned for all of these. My favorite tip on these questions is to always conclude your answer with, I really learned . Ending on that positive note helps you also get more skills into the conversation. I talked before about scenario questions. These, again, like I mentioned, I like this third example best. You don't have the information you need to prioritize your projects. Your coworkers and supervisor are unavailable. How do you handle the situation? This is a great example of a scenario question that kind of bleeds into behavioral, in that, yes, it's hypothetical, but they're trying to figure out, are you self-aware enough to describe your ability to manage your own time or your ability to ask for help? So these are not as common as the first two, but it's good to be a little bit prepared for some of these questions. So let's get into the qualifications questions. This is exactly this. We're going to go through sample questions with answers. This is a new handout we just finished that's not on our website. It's called Common Interview Questions and Answers, but it'll be on our site soon, and I will also include it as an attachment when I send you all the slide deck from this event, as well as the recording. I'll have all the handouts attached to that email as well. And it will go to the email that you use to RSVP in Handshake. All right, so we talked a little bit about how qualification questions are about experiences and skills and credentials, et cetera. And you really want to think through all of these are specific to the job description, right? So if I'm prepping someone for an interview, I can't do it without a job description because I need to go through the job description to figure out what qualifications are they looking for. I couldn't do it abstractly. So if you do want to do interview prep, come with a job posting, even if it's one you're not applying to, because that will help us tailor your answers for you. All right, so they also really give you the opportunity to kind of remind folks about what's on your resume, but you're not necessarily answering things the same way you would on a resume, right? You're not using bullets or any of that. So something like, tell me about yourself, that could be a really important missed opportunity. You might say, well, I grew up in Joliet and then I went to school in Minnesota and da, da, da. But that's, I mean, some of that is useful and fine, but you really want to say, give them a heads up about who you are in a career space. You can add personal, but that's not really the primary purpose here. It's something like, and here's our sample right here. I'm a junior at DePaul studying art history. I've experience in da, 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 da. You can see they didn't just end with, I'm a junior at DePaul studying art history. They went through, I've experience in, I recently completed da, da, da. Something like I enjoy is another way to bridge into some skills that you have, and a really easy way to bridge. Now, you don't have to introduce yourself with your school year every time by any means. And if you're a first year student, you may not want to. But if you're a master's student and you want them to know where you are in that program, you can lead with it. The biggest mistake folks make in this question or this answer is telling a life story or sharing details that aren't necessarily relevant. There's a world where you can mention that, you know, you participated in the Olympics or something, but in general, you want to give them more information about who you are as a candidate. Now, sometimes if this is a job where it's important that you have a passion, so for connecting diverse communities to health resources, that could come up here. That could come up like, also, I grew up on the south side of Chicago and I have a passion for da, da, da. So some of that can be folded in as long as it relates to your goals and your career interests. Any questions about this one? All right, we got a lot of these. I'm really excited about how robust this new handout is because it's one thing to see an example. It just really helps. Let me just make this smaller. This one is, what are your greatest strengths? So this is just this is a gimme in terms of an opportunity to talk about what you're good at. And this doesn't have to be, this can be a mix of soft and hard skills. So it might be, well, I think my biggest strength is I'm a problem solver. I'm really good at doing this. And in a previous example, and this is a really good example too of giving some evidence, not just making claims like I'm good at creativity, I'm good at this. That's not compelling until you add, you know, in this situation, I did this. One of the projects I worked on did this. This is a relatively easy answer to give. And some of what you'll observe as you script this is some of these answers will overlap each other, right? So you might have in Tell Us About Yourself talked about some of your strengths, and then you might have more real estate to do that. So if you keep your answers nice and succinct, about 2 to 3 minutes, then you won't worry too much about sounding like a broken record. But there will be overlap. That's definitely part of this puzzle. We'll talk about weaknesses in a minute. But another fun question that people really dread is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And you might be cynical about why that helps them understand you as a candidate. But what I like about this question is it's an opportunity for them to see where they fit in your goals, where they fit in your story. You can be general here too. I don't need you to say, I want this exact title, right? I'm going to get promoted twice and do this. I don't need that. But I think it's helpful to say something like, you know what, I'm actually really interested in food marketing. And that's why this role is perfect for me, because I want to build a career in that. Or you might say something like, right now, I'm considering law school in the long term, but this role is perfect for me because it would help me establish . So you kind of have to do the math for them, depending on what your answer to this is. And when we do mock interview and when we coach students on interviews, this is very much a conversation with a lot of variables. I want to know what your real goals are. The mistake question to this is something kind of, if you just don't take advantage of it and it's too generic, you're not actually taking advantage of an opportunity. Or you say something out of left field, right? Which happens a lot. When I'm interviewing candidates for roles at DePaul, they'll say something like, if I want, maybe it's a career advisor role, they'll say, oh, I want to be a psychiatrist or psychologist, but they don't tell me how this makes sense in that pathway. And then I'm like, oh, they just want this job because they get free tuition. I get it, but that's not as fun as me hiring someone who would kill to do this work, right? And part of this is really thinking through the experience of the person asking you this question. They want to think that you're going to be happy because it makes their lives easier if their employees are happy. So thinking through how you can convey to them that this is a destination for you is really helpful. And that's where I think most of my interview skills improved when I started interviewing and recruiting folks for my own team, because I started to have empathy for the people who are asking the questions and understanding why they were asking them. This is my favorite question to ask. And I don't do 5 years, but I'll often say something like, where does this role fit in your long-term plan? And I get really excited thinking about their future. Any question about this particular one? All right, we're going to go to, sorry, I have to make this smaller. Why are you interested in this position? So talk about overlap. This is heavy overlap with tell me about yourself. Because if they ask you, tell me about yourself, you've probably answered some of this. But it does give you and maybe they'll ask this one first and not ask, tell me about yourself. It's very similar. So you would talk about, well, here's why I'm interested. Now, if you're currently employed, they might say something like, what attracts you to this role given the current job you have? You never want to be negative about your current job. You never want to say, I mean, later on, depending on the nuance of conversation, you can be a little more honest, but you never want to say, you know what, I don't like the job I'm in right now because like the boss is crazy and da, da, da. You're never, ever, ever going to do that. You would typically say something like, you know, I really love my current job, but when I saw this opportunity, I got excited about the fact that it, da, 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 da. So this is a great place for you to demonstrate that you understand what the role is, you have enthusiasm for the company, and how it aligns with your skill set. So you want to talk about how you benefit them, not how they benefit you. I'm just going to ask my son to stop talking. One moment. Sorry, let me go back. I can't mute. Guys, I'm doing a presentation. You have to stop talking. Sorry about that. This is just the world we live in now. So this example is great. I'm excited about this position because it aligns with my skill set. I'm particularly interested in this industry. This was something I was good at. I'd love to learn da, da, da. Happy verbs are your best friend in scripting this, and happy verbs meaning I enjoy, I like, I want, like those are great bridges for matching with a role. Any questions about why are you interested?
So for the why you're interested, do you have to like give an example like what you did in your previous job?
No. So if you're currently job seeking and you if you don't have a current job, you can often answer this like, I'm really excited because I'm just emerging into the career of, you know, help desk and IT support. And this is a role that really appeals to me because of my skill set. And I enjoy doing this kind of work. But no, you don't have to line it up with any historical reference to a current job if you're in like a job search mode. Does that answer it?
Yes, thank
All
you.
right. Okay, the weaknesses question. I get this a lot. This is kind of, I consider a bit of a trick question, which is 100% fine. This is the reason they're asking this question is to understand if you're self-aware. Because if you're not self-aware, that doesn't help them. There's two things that might happen. You might be totally unself-aware about what your weaknesses are, and then they're like, oh, they're never going to accept feedback. Or you admit actual really problematic weaknesses. People do this all the time. I was interviewing someone for a role and they said, yeah, you know what, I'm just bad at project management. And I'm like, I now have this whole movie playing in my head of me having to, you know, figure out why projects aren't done. So you never want, I mean, interviewing is a performance. 100%. Yeah, I mean, I don't want you to go into it thinking you need to be someone else. but you do want to kind of prepare yourself to pitch, right? To pitch who you are. And to be authentic, but to really bring your brand in its best shape to the interview. So my favorite formula for the weakness question is to identify an actual weakness and then talk about how you've overcome it. I think a lot of people do well, I'm a perfectionist, and they imagine that sounds like, oh, they work really hard. In a lot of businesses, it's not good to have people who are perfectionists because they don't get things done on time, right? So that's not a great weakness to highlight. Or like this sample is kind of a good example of treading a middle ground here, where, you know what, I love what I do, and sometimes I say yes too much, right? And that can be bad because then it makes deadlines difficult. Like that's authentically a challenge. It's not just, oh, I work too hard. It's I say yes too much. And sometimes I committed to every request and I felt overwhelmed. So what I do now is I'm using Asana to project manage and asking more questions about expectations around timeline, et cetera. So you have to think through personally what's authentically true as a challenge for you, and then articulate how you're self-accommodating or how you're navigating through that challenge. So for most of us, there's a lot of things this could be. Sometimes it's project management, sometimes it's conflict avoidance, all kinds of stuff. But crafting a nice story around this about here are some strategies I've developed to fix what I would see as a weakness in myself. That's a compelling answer. You sound self-aware and you sound like someone who knows that no one's perfect and there's things that you could be better at, but you're still bringing your personal strengths to the table. Any questions about the weaknesses question?
Yes, the weaknesses question seems to be a very hard question to answer. So I know I've read some some articles that are saying take a strength and portray it as a weakness, and then so what do you think of that? Is that something a good strategy to do?
I think that advice is so common that a lot of people do it and it doesn't read as authentic.
Mm-hmm.
That's my risk around that, because when you think about the life of a phone screener or someone giving interviews, they're asking this question of 40 people a day. And it's not that you can't have the same answer as someone else, but you're not really taking advantage of an opportunity if you say like, oh, my weakness is I care too much, right? Like that just feels a little artificial. And it sounds to me like you're not really aware or you haven't overcome anything. So that's why I prefer the formula of putting a very positive spin on an authentic thing that you have personally worked on, that you have identified as a challenge and you have figured out how to overcome it, or you're in the process of figuring out how to overcome it. That's my preference, but it's not this question, none of these questions are going to make or break your entire interview at all. Like so much of the interview is about really the performance part, not just the script, but like, do you appear to be energetic? Are you, do you have great social skills, all that other stuff. So I think I just worry too much about like when there's advice like that, sometimes it's kind of like a resume template. Everyone's doing the same exact thing. And it just doesn't always read as authentic.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And if you guys like, seriously, if you're, most of my interview prep conversations are more me asking questions. So me saying to someone like, okay, what's the last big challenge you had? Because I can help you identify what that weakness was and how you overcame it. We're like ghost whisperers a little bit as far as like helping people prep for interviews. And this is something we do all the time. So I included in this presentation, this is part of an activity we provide for faculty to do with students, but I think it's helpful to think through how you would score yourself on any of these answers and how a recruiter might score you. So for example, tell me about your interest in this role. Here are the 3 things I think the recruiter needs to get from you. Did you clearly articulate your interest? Did you identify what makes you qualified? And did you express genuine interest in working with the employer? So this is something this is part of an activity. So you don't need to do this, but I wanted to give this to you as a resource when you're prepping your interviews thinking through, these are the things I need to do for any of these questions. So for example, what part of this role do you see as where you might have a learning curve or where you might face a challenge? It's similar to the weakness, but not identical. They want to know, okay, so my favorite answer to this is always, I think the biggest challenge in any new role is figuring out who everyone is, what they do, and what the culture is, right? And that's pretty consistent across the board. Like that's an answer I would give in almost any interview, because I have found that to be true. It is very difficult when you come into a new role to really get all the moving parts together and to get to learn the history and to understand where everyone's moving. But you could also really say, you know what, I'm excited about this role because I have used data analytics for social media, but this is going to be a great opportunity for me to fully build those skills. So you could pick a specific skill that you wanted to grow. You just had to be really delicate about whether or not you're compensating for that with other skills. But some of the way you would score yourself is, did you identify a skill or knowledge that you would need to build in the role? Did you articulate how you would build that skill? So you would answer like, I'm excited about doing that, and in fact, I just started a free Google Analytics course or something. Was the interviewee authentic, positive, and enthusiastic? Like that's part of the performance piece of that grade. But it's helpful sometimes when you're writing this to understand these are the things that they want. But I'll attach this activity to the presentation I send out. This isn't taken from recruiter's notes or anything like that. This is something we designed for a peer-to-peer interview feedback activity. All right, behavioral. In my opinion, the behavioral questions require the most preparation because they ask you to specifically describe an experience. And they do often have hot button prompts, right? Like, tell me at a time you experienced conflict. If you haven't prepared the answer to that, you're going to immediately in your head go to some stressful moment that you had experienced at work. And it's going to be hard for you to articulate how you manage that. So the biggest thing in the behavioral questions is to be collected, calm, and positive, and tell a story, but there's a lot of room for not overloading them with detail. That's another risk you take. So here's a good example of any question that starts with tell me about a time or how do you do, those tend to be behavioral. So this one would be tell me about a time when you had multiple responsibilities and how you managed it. This might be tell me about a time when you were managing, too many projects. So you want to keep your story short and positive. And this is really where working with a career advisor is super helpful, because we can help you basically edit the story you tell us as kind of inspiration for this into a fully packaged answer. And that's what this is, we're packaging, right? So this example, there's no blame in here, right? My coworker had a family emergency right in the middle of a major project. You're not saying my stupid coworker decided that was the time they were going to go and that's what you want to avoid. I can't tell you how many students, the group projects you guys do in school are fodder for this drama, right? Like that's when I get the conflict question, I'm like, all right, tell me about the last group project you did. Because it's often, yeah, my group did nothing. I did everything. I told the teacher, they didn't care. That's what you don't want to do, right? You don't want to get into that verbal diarrhea space where you're negative. So in this case, here's what I did to make this happen. Here's a strategy. And then you can often add with something like, I really learned how to master time management, or this was a good experience for me because, right? So I'm packaging in this answer. Here's a challenge I had. Here's a skill I developed, part of a story. And sometimes that story is a specific incident, like in this case. Sometimes it's more about a role. Frankly, if any of you work in food service or retail, you all have a conflict story. Absolutely. But you, instead of saying, yeah, this one time this lady came up, wouldn't wear a mask, you could sometimes answer these questions with, I work in retail. I have a lot of customers that do not agree with some of our store policies, like mask wearing. So on a daily basis, I have to manage someone coming in with a lot of feelings and the policies that my store enforces for health and safety. So my strategy for doing that is to, and then and then craft a statement about a skill you have. Willie, I'm doing a recorded presentation. What do you want?
Can I get those games?
Not right now. Sorry. Questions about that? Tell me about one. So those tell me about questions could be a time you had conflict, a time you led something, a time you had to change your mind. That was one that I was not prepared for when I got that one. And I love it. I think it's a great question. Really around leadership, conflict management, collaboration, all of those really core soft skills. The other way to ask this is, how do you handle conflict in the work environment? And again, the wrong way to answer this is like, I go straight to my boss, or, I'm so frank, I go right to them. You don't want to sound, you want to be in the middle of the road, calm, collected, not overwhelmed. So I think that a lot of these answers will feel the same for most people, because you basically want to be able to say, you know what, if I'm feeling like there's conflict in the workspace, I take a step back. I think about, hey, what are they worried about? They have strong feelings about this. What can I do to understand their perspective better, right? So that's kind of a more general answer, but that's kind of the direction most of those conflict questions and answers need to go. Any questions about those two? Let me just see if anything's in the chat. Nope. Okay. You guys are quiet today. Tell me about a time you failed. This is exactly like the weakness one, in that you should authentically pick something that did not go as well as you'd planned and talk about what you learned from it. And that is why scripting is important, because if I'm doing this off the cuff, I won't really I won't bring any art to this answer, right? I'll just say something like, the last time I failed. Actually, let me think how I would answer that right now. God, there's so many parenting ones that you guys will not be interested in. I might say something like, yeah, I held an event and I thought it would be like a huge hit and everyone would come, and no one did. And then what do they get out of that answer? Nothing. You just learned that I did an event and nothing happened. And I demonstrated to you that I don't learn from my failures by answering that way. So crafting these in advance is core, because you would follow up with, I had this event, here's why I thought it was going to be great, here's how I marketed it, here are all the things I did to make it succeed, because there's a difference between engineered success and engineered failure, right? And then, okay, afterward, I reflected on it and I was like, this is the thing that I didn't understand. I didn't understand my users, and I thought they had this need, but they had a different need. So it is about this packaging, and it is about preparing these answers, because there are very few people in the world who think quickly enough to be able to do this particularly well. And once you've got that interview, I want you to take full advantage of it. There's not a single, if you have an interview, I need you to do a mock interview in advance. It's a muscle, and you build it doing it. So if you're scheduling interviews, make sure that you are getting some interview practice in. This is the handout I talked about, common interview questions. This has all of the content that we've worked through primarily, except for the rubrics for scoring it. But this has all of those sample questions and answers. In terms of behavioral questions, though, this is this is another rubric for how you would evaluate a successful behavioral question answer. You can see the first thing is succinctness. Are they succinct about the actual project? I was interviewing at the University of Minnesota, and we asked a candidate, so tell us about your interest in this role. And she literally started with, when I was in 7th grade, and this woman was 50 years old. We were in for an 18-minute interview answer that didn't get us anywhere. I mean, that answer alone was like, oh my God, this isn't going to work, right? So you want to be succinct. Did they successfully demonstrate the skill So you can see the interviewee describe their approach to working as part of a team. That you can tell this question is talking about teams. Did they really describe their approach? And then were they positive, really? And did they relate it back to this role and to this experience? So these are the things you want to go for when you're answering behavioral questions. So
Does succinct mean?
Succinct means complete information in a small amount of time, right? So the opposite of too much, too many words, the perfect amount of words.
Okay.
Very brief. So other examples in this role, you have to problem solve. What is your approach to managing change? They want you in this answer to actually describe your approach to managing change and to be succinct about the experience and then to be positive. So these overlap a lot. Now, number 5, this is my favorite prep to do. And this is where the internet will not give you good advice about this. The rest of the stuff we're talking about, the internet, particularly oddly Reddit, has a lot of great advice. But what questions do you have for me at this time? We're going to transition into a handout that goes through that, but there are some opportunities here. Are you asking a question that expresses knowledge or interest in the role or the industry? And are you asking a question that allows you to reiterate some of your skills, right? So let's shift into this conversation. Oh, I want to skip all the way to, sorry, I'm going to come back to prepare for the interview. This is the first time I'm using this deck, and I'm going to change the order on this. Okay, so this is a handout we have called Asking Great Questions in Your Interview. This, like I said, is my favorite thing to prep because this is where you go from an A to an A+. This is where you really out interview anyone else because people don't put enough time into this. Let me see if there's a quick question in the chat. With little work experience, would you talk about your school affairs experience? Absolutely. If you don't have a ton of work experience, of course you're talking about what you did in school. And the skills you have are from school. So I don't ever hesitate. Now, if it's high school that you're referring to, I obscure the fact that it's high school. But anything else is on the table as far as talking about your skills and experiences. Okay, so for preparing interview questions, there's a couple different kinds of questions. There's the role specific ones where they're really focused on what are the duties and expectations. These are pretty common questions. So for example, what do you think the biggest challenges in this role are? Now, if I get the answer to this, that's like, well, the biggest challenge is no days like the same. Did I get anything out of that? No. Until this is the kind of question where you ask it, they answer it, and then you say, well, that sounds really exciting to me. I love having multiple priorities every day, right? So the follow-up to their answer is where you're scoring points for some of these questions. Does that make sense? It's not just asking the question is great because you're getting information that you need, but you get to score extra credit points by following up with like, oh, that sounds really great because I'm the kind of person who really loves that kind of workspace. Another question would be, what does success look like in this role and how is it measured? And then they say, well, it's measured by this much in sales and this much in whatever. And then you go, oh, I really enjoy sales and I'm really excited about this opportunity. Like you piggyback back onto that every time. And you can see this is an example here and some description, like after listening, I mean, don't have this locked and loaded, listen to their actual answer and then map it back to who you are and why you're qualified. The other kinds of questions you can ask are industry trends. Some of these require a significant amount of research, which is why I think it's useful during your job search to just be aware of what trends are and just be constantly looking at. I love limiting my Google search on an industry trends to the past month because then I'm kind of on top of that stuff. But you can, so here are some examples. Let me make this a little smaller. I know that data security is an increasingly important issue across healthcare. Is this a trend that's impacted this role? Now, obviously that's written for a healthcare related role, right? That's why we're talking about that. But, and what we get by asking that question, we're scoring points because we understand that a common trend And then when they answer it, you can speak to your interest in that again, like the other question. You can also frame this as, recently I read an article about da, da, da. Does this role get involved in da, da, da? You can see these examples kind of illustrate that. Company specific can be hard because you have to, it's not always really easy to get information about a company, like real information about a company from their website. They're all going to say they're great. They're all going to say they do the A, B, and C in the same work. But if you know that there's been restructuring or there's a new service, you can refer to that and ask, you know, where's that at? How is that impacting this office? And then you look like someone who did some homework, which isn't bad. The other question you can ask is, what do you see in the next 5 years for this company? What's the biggest change that's going to impact this role? And then you illustrate the fact that you understand things change and that you're not afraid of that. And that's a benefit. Finally, tactical. Do not forget tactical. What are the next steps in this process? What is the overall timeline? It's really helpful just to know that, because if you've got multiple roles you're interviewing for, it's helpful if they say, well, we're phone screening this whole week, and then we're going to do round 2 a week and a half from now. If 2 weeks pass, maybe you have a sense that that's not moving, you're not moving forward. They're never going to tell you until they have to tell you. So it's helpful to know what the next steps are, because they also help you prepare. Questions about the questions that you can ask during a job interview? Let me just do a sideline on salary. We're going to go back to preparing. Oh, this is, sorry, an additional tips for how to research questions. And definitely don't ask yes or no questions. Like, do you like working here? That you don't get anything out of that. Don't ask hard to answer questions, like very narrow, specific questions about, like, you're never going to ask, like, well, do you use Excel here? Do you use da, da, da? You're not going to do that. And don't ask questions about salary and benefits. This, I will say there are exceptions to that. So let's talk really quickly about salary. Sorry, these are our handouts. I'm going to change the order of this. We have a whole handout called Negotiation and Job Offers. One thing I think everyone needs to know during the job search is that if you are asked in the online application to indicate your salary, we generally recommend that you write the word variable, or if it's numerical, the number 1 or the number 0. Now, that's because, now this isn't always the case, but this can be beneficial because you don't necessarily want to put in a number lower than what they had originally planned for that role. And if you are asked during the interview what your salary expectations are, our general recommendation is to flip it back onto the interviewer and say, actually, this was a question I had for you. And I wouldn't ask this unless they asked me, right? If they ask me, hey, what's your salary expectations? I might say, that was a question I had for you. What is the range you guys have allocated for this role? And then you're getting information rather than lowballing yourself. That's the last thing we want to do. Of course, you can research salary on Glassdoor, and I recommend you do that. I mean, it's user reported, so it's not like the only thing. But as far as like that salary question in the interview, I prefer to pop it back to them. Now, if they're pushier and they're like, well, we really wanted to hear from you what your desired salary was, you can say, I just really want to learn a little bit more about this role before I really determine what the salary would be. And that's not impolite. That's 100% fine. In a dream world, they tell you during a screen or one of those layers, they say what the range is, and then you have a better sense of what that would be. It's sometimes around 2, sometimes around 3, sometimes around 1. You never know when they're going to do that. I'm going to go back to preparing for the interview, but any questions about those salary questions? All right, great. We just want you to feel empowered. All right, I'm going to go back to prepare. Okay. So in terms of preparation, the steps we recommend are to, let me make this smaller, obviously get that job title, get that job description out and really study it. I mean, you've done that when you're writing the resume and cover letter already, but really study it out. And this is just a quick pro tip on this. I generally I work in Google Docs. So in my Google Doc cover letter, I will often at the very bottom paste in the entire job posting because those disappear. So you might have applied for a job 2 weeks ago, they call you for an interview and that posting's gone. And you're like, oh, what was that? Like, I don't remember all the details about it. Now, sometimes Wayback Machine can get you there if you know the URL, but sometimes it's helpful just to have it posted somewhere. So I typically do that because that's happened to me too many times where I've lost it and I've gotten in an interview and I'm like, oh, I don't even remember all the details about this posting. So really skim through that. Of course, you're going to research the company because you might walk in and they'll say, tell us what you know about us. And you want to have an answer to that. I mean, it doesn't have to be wild. Well, your CEO is da, da, da. It doesn't need to be that. It should be something, you start with their about us section. I love for a larger company to use the Wikipedia just to figure out, okay, this is what they do. What do they do? How do they talk about themselves? Really think through what do they see as their differentiation? That's very important because you are looking at differentiating yourself from other candidates as well as how they see themselves as different. And practice for sure, script and practice the talking part of those scripts. Like I'm not, like I said, ever reading a script, but I am writing it and reading it in advance of my interview. And I have done practice interviews for most of the interviews I've done in my career. Now this varies a little bit during the pandemic in terms of planning your clothing. Things have changed a lot, right? So like, you want to err on the side of what their culture is. So sometimes it's helpful to look at an employer's social media and see what people are wearing in the workplace, right? I mean, few people are in the workplace, but this was a good tip. And then err on a little more formal than what they're doing. For women, this is a much easier proposal, right? Like layer a cardigan over something, a blazer, right? And blazers are casual too. So there's a lot of options. For anyone who identifies as male, it gets a little harder in terms of like button up with a tie. In some cases in your industry, dressy might be just a button shirt with a cardigan on it. So looking at the social media of the folks who work there is helpful to get a sense of what works. And then I think one of my favorite pro tips in person and not in person, this is actually really useful even for a video interview, is to have a pen and paper and to be taking notes while you're talking. It helps you not fidget. Like I like talking with my hands, but it does help me also to like look like I'm listening, like I'm writing notes like, oh, okay, this is something that's interesting to me. And I'll have notes for later for myself. You do typically want to bring a copy of your materials if you're in person. In the whole world of the video interview, the blur background is a really great tool for you in terms of, I mean, any background works really, but you do kind of want to think through, like right now, it's daylight out longer, earlier in the year, I would have had to have a light on to make this screen work. You think through all of that, where your camera is, like it, for example, if you're set up like this, that's not really doing what it needs to do. You want to make sure that you position everything the way you need to position it so that they can see who you are. For a phone interview, I'm obsessed with looking in a mirror while you're on the phone, because if you're a fan of America's Next Top Model, you remember smize. Well, I think there's smears, meaning I think they can hear you being pleasant, right? And your tone changes when you're smiling and you're looking at yourself and you're having this back and forth with yourself. So in a phone interview, I think it's really helpful to give yourself that social feedback, that nonverbal feedback in a mirror. It sounds crazy. It works for some people. Not everyone needs to do it. And then of course, if you're traveling for the interview, just be prepared to get there on time. I know that sounds crazy, but it's just given, particularly pre and post pandemic, hopefully in the city, there's a lot of unpredictability about some kinds of transportation. You don't want to lose your mind if you're, a couple minutes late. And I always bring a pair of shoes to change into, but that's because I like to wear power heels when I interview and I don't like walking in them. So that's a pro tip for anyone who wears heels. I put them in a bag, and then when I get there, I pop them on before I get in the office. A couple other things I want to share. We talked about great interviews. And like I said, you can schedule an appointment with a career advisor to do mock interview anytime. If you do have an interview scheduled unexpectedly, check our availability, but you can also sometimes message through the chat and we can sometimes find someone with shorter notice. But right now we only need 24-hour notice to schedule an appointment. And every single career advisor can help you, even depending on your industry. So if you see someone's booked, try somebody else. We're all going to be equipped to help you. Here are some of the handouts that we have in the Career Center. We have one specifically on mastering the video interview. I just knew I would take about an hour on this, so I didn't want to get into all those details. That's particularly relevant now. This is what the Ask Great Questions handout. We have a Dress for Success handout. I think this is going to need revision post-pandemic. I think a lot of places are going to have a very different model for what we call like professional dress, or at least that's what I hope as someone who hasn't worn dress pants in about a year. We have other resources. This is the salary and negotiating job offers resources that we want to make sure you know about. Let me see if there's any. Okay, we want to make sure you know about all of our services too. A quick illustration of all the items in our career library. There are 2 more skills labs coming up. One is Intro to Design Thinking, that's this Friday. And then the other one is Agile Project Management, and I do not remember the date, but that's coming. Internship Plus is already passed. Oh, I don't have my slide. We have a bunch of 2 credits. Let me actually I'll show you really quickly what these look like. I'll just go to DePaul Career Center. This is for those of you who are going to be enrolling in the fall. We have, or summer, we have quite a few 2 credit courses focused on career topics, including job and internship search. So if you go to resources, career courses, and then you go to, there's the EL course, of course, but we also have Design Your Future, Create Your Career Toolkit, Harness Your Strengths, Launch Your Search. These are offered every quarter. I'm going to give you time to ask questions. I'm going to stop share. I'm going to give you time to ask questions. And while I do that, I'm going to throw a poll out there. I see one question. Can you ask how many other people have applied for the job? Well, one of the benefits of LinkedIn is you can see how many people have applied for a job on that platform. But you can also assume truly that about 250 people at least have applied for any open role. That's the average pre-pandemic. So my assumption is that number is really big. If you get an interview, that means your resume worked, right? And so that's what's exciting. The interview is your chance to win this role. The one thing I will say about that though is I was working with a student who's incredible at interviewing. And for 2 positions in a role, she made it to the final round and she didn't get it. And both times it's because there was a unicorn, right? There was just someone she was competing against who they had a thing that she didn't have. And those people there are not a lot of them in the world. But when I don't get a role, I really do often check in, well, who got it? And then go, oh, they wanted that, right? I get it. You don't have to always want what I'm bringing to the table. So as much as I want you to prepare for your interviews, Omar, the unicorn reference is like this like kind of mythical perfect candidate. This person who has this skill that just you didn't even know were out in the world. And so sometimes, it's not a match. Sometimes they don't want what you're bringing to the table, but that doesn't mean that what you're bringing to the table isn't great. But once you get that interview, we want to make sure you take the time to do the prep, because once you've gotten that, getting the interview is a very big deal and a very exciting step. And we want to make sure you leverage that as much as possible. You're also better at interviewing the more you do. So if you are hesitating on applying for different roles while you're in an interview process, do not hesitate. It's always good to keep that muscle working. Obviously, if you're happy in a